Welcome to the SHAPE webinar, the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza and the deepening regional and global crisis. And this webinar will be recorded and we place onto the SHAPE website. So if you want to see the full webinar and would like to share with your friends, you can also share it through there. A link to the website itself will be placed afterwards in the chat. And for those who would like to ask questions to the respective panelists and of course to the speakers, please use the Q&A feature available in the panel section for your Zoom account. The question itself will be directed to the moderator, which will then be directed to the respective speakers and panelists. Okay, so I think it's time. So again, the webinar is now officially started and opened. I would like to introduce and pass the webinar floor to our respective moderator, Victoria Britton. Victoria Britton is a British journalist and author born in India who has spent most of her career in the Global South. She has lived and worked in Saigon, Algiers, and Nairobi, and she has reported from countries in North, Southeast, and West Africa, and is still in touch with continent as a member of a French collective website, Afrique21, I believe. And she has been a visitor to Gaza and the West Bank for 20 plus years. Victoria Britton has worked at the London Guardian newspaper for 25 years and contributed to many other media outlets and has written a number of books and a play. And she will be our respected moderator for today's session. So Victoria, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And I think it's good morning to some. It's certainly good evening to others. And here in Europe, it's good afternoon. It's wonderful that everybody's joined. And I'm so happy that this opportunity to discuss with the very interesting group of people that are speaking to us today. At this moment, we're 200 days into this horrendous genocide. And I think it's almost past imagining what the 2 million people in Gaza have gone through and are going through every minute. And also for all Palestinians who are not in Gaza, or indeed in the West Bank, where the violence, as you know, is extremely intense. This is just a moment that nobody ever saw coming, with this horrendous refusal by the Israeli Prime Minister and his government to enter into any kind of meaningful discussion. And we're also seeing at this very moment a challenge to international law and to the United Nations demands is completely and utterly unprecedented. I'm not going to say more now because we have these wonderful speakers who are going to raise so many different aspects of everything that's going on. So I want to start by introducing the first of our guests, the writer Susan Abulhawa. And before actually introducing her, I'm just going to say that if any of you have what I find I have, friends who say, it's all so complicated, this is the book that they should read, which shows it isn't complicated. It's horrendous, but it isn't complicated. So that's a plug for Susan's book. She has also been twice in Gaza recently, and will be able to discuss a bit of that with us. But I won't say more about her activism, her writing in so many different places, and as a kind of role model of what it is to be a highly responsible intellectual. Susan is one of my heroines, and I'm very, very happy to introduce her. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Victoria. It was a very generous introduction. I'm going to just read something that includes a published article that I wrote a few weeks ago, and some points that might seem disparate, but will hopefully come together for you. By now, everyone understands, or should understand, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. They are executing a campaign of extermination against a principally unarmed indigenous population. The statistics alone are enough to shock the conscience. The raw footage and sounds of unspeakable carnage are undeniable. Whole families buried alive en masse in the rubble of their homes, torn bodies, shredded bodies, broken bodies, burnt bodies, dismembered bodies everywhere, and wanton destruction of everything in the whole of Gaza. Still, what I witnessed on the ground, even for a small period of time, and even in just a small area of Gaza, is infinitely worse than the worst video you've seen. The enormity of harm truly beggars belief. The near total degradation of an entire high-functioning society in a short span of time is difficult to comprehend. Surely the widespread lack of adequate sustenance and sanitation, coupled with unceasing terror, testing of new weaponry, and an AI-guided death industry has made Gaza the most macabre experiment of empire. What we're witnessing in Gaza is the culmination of decades of capitalist colonial ambitions that have been grooming us all and incrementally pushing the boundaries of our acquiescence since traditional European colonial powers were forced to retreat from their colonies and since the United States was unceremoniously ousted from Vietnam by lightly armed guerrilla forces. Despite the romantic narrative surrounding the establishment of Israel, complete with an aura of happy ending to Europe's genocide of their own Jewish citizenry, the reality is that Israel was created as a Western colonial outpost in a resource-rich region. It was Europe's last hurrah as a colonial powerhouse, which the US adopted in earnest, particularly in the wake of the '67 war. The greatest impediment to empire is, and historically has always been, the conscience and the consent of masses. After decades of imperial wars, environmental destruction, the gutting of public services and public institutions, and the fleecing of workers, empire is at last having to contend with mass discontent on this occasion of genocide. At some point, the boundaries are pushed too far. There was a hint of this in the student movements in the '60s and '70s that spurred an end to America's slaughter in Vietnam and Cambodia, and the moral force of Black people rising together in their pain and rage against legislated racism changed the social fabric of America, ending formal segregation and ushering a new era in the struggle against institutional racialism. Power did what power does, deploying brute force, murder, intimidation, silencing, marginalizing, surveillance, and all manner of corrupt policing. We see the outcome and we think we know it. Labels like victory and advancement are applied. Civil rights is a term spoken as an absolute, a singular point of history with a terrible before and liberated after. It's that happy ending reframing of what is indeed a boundless thread of struggle in both directions through time. The resilience of elite capitalist rule relies heavily on this kind of narrative construction that manipulates public imagination with platitudes and reversible concessions, followed by a rebranding of oppression. Enslavement becomes mass incarceration and purposeful drug addiction. Segregation is sacrificed to be replaced with conscription of Black faces around the same table of power ethos. Power adapted since the 1960s, creating new stops, levers, gates, and gatekeepers. They lulled us back into their system, rebooted it with greater cruelty and corruption, and retooled it with distractions and celebrity worship, while they consolidated and concentrated power in the hands of a tiny minority. They bought politicians who in turn worked to safeguard and increase the wealth and influence of this elite minority through various tax loopholes, deregulations, and privatization of public institutions, and all manner of legislations that turned millionaires into billionaires and soon trillionaires. A staggering wealth gap built on the misery of the masses. They created laws to exonerate their criminality and laws to criminalize our dissent. They busted up the unions, subjugated workers, and pitted them against each other. They scrapped environmental regulations and wildlife protections to continue extraction while polluting the planet. The deregulations allowed this tiny minority to buy up the airwaves, so now they dictate the content of 95% of everything we see, hear, and read in the way of mainstream journalism, entertainment, education, and cultural productions. It is not by accident that terrorist characters dominate Arab depictions in Hollywood. The unusually high number of casual mentions of Israeli benevolence or Israeli genius in so many television series and films is intentional. And it is through such management of public sentiment over decades that Palestinian humanity is shamefully trivialized or ignored in both print and broadcast news media, no matter how many atrocities we face at Israel's hands. It is the reason why people can watch the wholesale vandalizing of our lives without flinching, whether it's in Palestine, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Syria, Somalia, Lebanon. If what's happening to Palestinians were happening to Israelis, we all know there would be zero tolerance for another single bomb. Whereas the equivalent of double the firepower of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki have rained down on Gaza, and the whole world is still debating whether it or not it should go on. Instead of paying taxes, this elite ruling class, these billionaires, donate to universities sufficient sums to impose their vision, not only for higher education, but for the acceptable expression of constitutional rights like the First Amendment. Americans tried to stop the march of US corporate and Zionist warmongers toward war in the early 2000s, but they marched on, trampling our will and trampling the bodies of millions of Iraqis. And the whole world watched as the US pulverized that once glorious, high-functioning ancient society. The way they pushed on, ignoring the will of the people, was itself an experiment in how they would continue to push the envelope, as it were. At the time, I recall analysts saying that Iraq finally broke the stigma of Vietnam and freed Americans to pursue militarism and imperial adventures. And embedded media hid the bloody horrors of that naked attack on a sovereign nation and kept the secrets of US corporate looting of Iraq's treasures and the laundering of US tax dollars through rebuilding schemes. Desensitized and disempowered, Americans didn't bother protesting when the US did the same thing in Libya, spurring a staggering de-development of one of Africa's most advanced nations into a veritable human slave market. The enslavement and mutilation of Congolese children and whole families in mineral mines to benefit American and Israeli tech billionaires, as well as to fuel Israel's blood diamond industry, barely elicit a blip in Western media, a shockingly cruel reality they continue to obscure. There are hundreds more bloody examples of American and Israeli adventures in killing and destroying others in the service of this ruling corporate class. Mass surveillance of the populace followed by the gutting and looting of public education in the United States. The rich got richer and the poor became destitute. They have weighed us down with fake dreams that they scripted for us. Insurmountable debt as a stand-in for education, a white picket fence and endless consumption as a stand-in for family, blood diamonds as a stand-in for love, and carnage abroad as a stand-in for greatness. They sold us a glorious pile of shit and made us think it was all there is, that such an unnatural and parasitic way of life was normal, even inevitable. They glorified obsessive consumerism and obscenely ostentatious lifestyles, and we let them, believing it was our choice. But choice, like democracy and free press, is an American illusion, a fairy tale they peddle in school and newspapers and songs. This moment of live stream genocide is the culmination of decades of global capitalist criminality and genocidal Western and Zionist imperialism. We watch in horror and perceived impotence. Then they gaslight us. Politicians, spokespeople, pundits, journalists, and broadcasters take to the airways to convince us that we hadn't just seen brains, tongues, and eyeballs spilling from the crushed skulls of children, or worse, that they somehow deserved it. Fog of war, collateral damage, Hamas, 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 the only democracy, self-defense. Over and over, they use their wicked justifications and obfuscations. They speak to us as if we're stupid because they're accustomed to our silence and acquiescence. But thank God for Palestinians and their allies who refuse to submit or remain silent. This time is different from the uprisings of the 60s and 70s. There is a new sense of global interconnection, an emerging class consciousness, and foundational political analyses that are predicated on post-colonial studies and intersectionality, none of which were present decades ago. Gaza is no longer the enclave sealed and besieged by Israel and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's Egypt into a concentration camp. Gaza is no longer the densely populated strip of Israeli-occupied land. Rather, Gaza is now all of us. It is all the world. Gaza is our collective moment of truth. It is the meaning in our lives. It is the clarity that we need and seek. It is the definitive divide between us and the ruling class that tramples us. All the borders fade, leaving us united to confront this greedy, genocidal minority everywhere. Gaza is the most anguished place on earth at this hour, and from this tortured place of rubble, death, and misery, there springs a great light to guide us out of this darkness that has been forced upon us. It is the light of our ancestors from Palestine and Al-Kebulan to Turtle Island and Aotearoa. If we allow the wheels of this genocidal Zionist engine to keep turning, there will be no more limits to fascism. There will be no shame, no red lines before which they will halt. There will be no boundaries against which they will need to push. This struggle can no longer be just about a ceasefire. It must demand liberation and accountability across our burning planet. Already they are using tactics of brute force, intimidation, suspension, marginalization. They will offer half-baked promises with no teeth to quiet matters long enough to adopt new strategies and enact new laws. We cannot leave the lawns and streets and courts and battlefields until Zionism is dismantled and Palestine is free. We must throw all of ourselves and our resources into this moment of global reckoning and not retreat. We must fight them in the courtrooms, in culture, in universities, in our jobs, and how we spend our money. We must boycott, withdraw, and withhold our attention from them on social media to affect their bottom lines. We must continue to find creative ways of resistance and employ them until we win. And we most certainly can win through our persistence. Staying the course is the least we can do as brave fighters face the most ruthless and deadly military machines the world has ever known. They do so with extraordinary bravery, resolve, and faith. History promises us that the tides will turn decisively in our favor. We already see this happening, but I believe it will be more dramatic and clear in short time, even as Israel's genocide becomes more ferocious. This moment belongs to us, the people. We can dream our own dreams and create a new world in every personal act of refusal to participate in this horrible system predicated on genocide and unrelenting exploitation. We can transform our relationship to the natural world from its current parasitic form to a symbiotic relationship. Together, we are powerful beyond our wildest imaginations. Compassion and defiance are our superpowers, and this is just our origin story. The youth are leading and showing us that the future is ours if we dare to claim it. And it would seem that the world we want and need must and will pass through this birthing canal called Gaza, Palestine. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan, for that very, very moving, strong call to action. But I think the most important thing is the way you've said that Gaza is our collective moment of truth. Palestinian courage and creativity are affecting the whole world, and the global reckoning and the tide turning that you've spoken about is surely the way forward. So now I want to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Swee Ang, who is known, I'm sure, to many, many of you watching this webinar. Dr. Swee became a Palestinian in 1982 in Sabra and Shatila, when a very young doctor, knowing nothing of Palestine, went out to see what she could do, how could she work as a doctor. And she wrote an excellent book about it, which you can easily find. After that, she became, to carry everything that she'd learned forward, she became the founder of MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians, which again, as many of you know, is one of the leading organizations that has worked within Gaza and still does, and all over the West Bank. The last time there was a flotilla to Gaza, Swee was on the flotilla. When they were attacked by the Israelis, she was arrested. And when she was freed and allowed to come back to Britain, she was, of course, banned from traveling ever again to Gaza and the West Bank. Well, it won't be never again. Meanwhile, she is one of the most tireless speakers on this issue and is all over London. She's already spoken at one meeting today before coming on to speak to us now. So Swee, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you all for having me speak here. And after speaking at so many demonstrations, meetings, encampments, and all that over the last few months, I cannot talk in a coherent and analytical style like Susan. So I'm so glad that she's done that for us. What I'm going to talk now is, what shall we do? Some of us are feeling so helpless, and many of us are crying day and night thinking about Gaza. But what Susan has highlighted is this is a major threshold moment, because it is, for the first time, I just recollect, you see, when the massacre in Sabra and Shatila was happening, nobody knew. Even we, the doctors, were not quite sure, because we're operating non-stop in the basement operating theater. And they murdered 3,500 people. And we only found out when we were arrested and walked through the main street of the camp and saw the dead bodies. And the press only released the story a day after the massacre was over. So today, we don't have that. Today, the Palestinians are actually filming the execution and sending it live. And that's why, you know, the change of heart and change of attitude in so many people is tremendous. And people and areas of countries where everybody now might not understand the historical context of 7th of October, but they can see the injustice and criminality and the cruelty done on the Palestinian people. Simple example, the country where I was educated and grew up is Singapore. Singapore has been called the Israel of the East. And for 47 years, I've been exiled from Singapore, not because of Palestinians, but because of my husband's human rights activities. But a couple of months, I went back to talk to the Harvard Club. And again, I said, look, I cannot talk to such a prestigious platform because I've got nothing to say. I'm not an academic. They say, no, we want you to talk about Gaza and bring all your slides. We want to see it. We know it. And people have changed. The government, pushed by the people, also have to change. When Israel defunded UNRWA, it broke most of our hearts. I've seen very eminent Palestinians come to tell me, without UNRWA, we won't be where we are. They vaccinated our children. They help build our homes. They teach us in primary school. They have clinics. Where will we be and how would we? Now is the moment when we need United Nations most, but they have defended it. And Singapore, you know, is so territorial that nobody can demonstrate. So we don't have this 1 million people out in the street, never to mention encampment. But when I flew in on a plane, the public of Singapore, the young people and just ordinary people have already collected $6 million and sent it to UNRWA. So this is the kind of hard change we experience all over the world. And meeting young people who are prepared to sacrifice their future, their education, people who are supposed to graduate and are suspended, prepared to pay the price just to, number one, tell the whole world what is justice, what they should do, and exhibiting the most courageous stand to ask for their corporate university administration to divest from investing in genocide and apartheid. So that gives us hope. And for me now, one part of me is extremely painful because of the people who died. You're talking about 10,000 women, and 10,000 women means they are no longer able to look after their families, their children. And what is genocide? Destroying people by destroying the mechanism of the next generation to survive and to bring forth. Destroying homes, destroying hospitals, destroying and killing doctors. And, you know, because of a robust medical service is one means of a society to survive. They destroyed that. But what we'll do, we will promise to help the Palestinians rebuild it. You know, I just feel, I think the time for crying is over. The time for action is here. And the future, the imminent future is painful, but I think the dawn is coming. The darkest hour is just before dawn. And we'll see a sunrise in Gaza. And I say, because of Gaza, we have hope not only for Palestine, but for the whole world. That's it. I'll make it short.
That's fantastic, Swee. Thank you so much. I love the way you talk about this Singapore visit and the $6 million that have been collected for UNRWA, because one of the most cruel overall things that the Israelis have done was this attempt to get rid of UNRWA altogether, and the spineless actions of most of the West to go along with it, and America actually passing a law to make sure that not one penny would go to UNRWA in the next year, just completely beggars belief. But also you highlighted what I think is for all of us, the uplifting nature of the courage of the young, which we are seeing all the time. And to end with dawn is coming and action is necessary, I think is exactly the watchword that is behind this whole idea of our SHAPE webinar today. So I'm now going to introduce the three co-conveners of SHAPE to enlarge the conversation between the five of you. Richard Falk needs no introduction. It's almost impossible to go through the list of things which you all know, because like Swee, he's on a webinar in and out, and he's written so many books, including actually a fantastic autobiography for those who haven't seen it. And most importantly, I think for this, at this moment, he was, of course, a UN rapporteur on human rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. And all the time he held that post and he wrote those devastating reports one after another. He was never allowed to visit the territories. And nonetheless, he carried on with his work, interviewing people, meeting people outside, and having absolutely his finger on the pulse. So thank you, Richard, for all those years and words that have educated so many of us. And the second one is our friend Chandra Mustafa, who is very well known in Asia and rather less well known in Europe. And it's wonderful that we in this group managed to pull people together from across the world. So Chandra is the president of the International Movement for a Just World based in Malaysia. And I think that his publications, he's written many books, and his publications have all been about civilizational dialogue, international politics, human rights. And as one of the three co-conveners, he's a very key activist on our conversation now. And the third is another emeritus professor, Joe Camilleri is speaking to us from the middle of the night in Australia. And thank you very much for pinching yourself to keep awake, Joe. His central interest as an academic has very much been international politics, and he shares exactly the same values of international cooperation and work for a safer world and everything that SHAPE is all about. So I'd ask you three to unmute yourself, and perhaps I can just say, let's just start this by asking Richard to say a few words on this critical moment for international law and what has happened of such importance in the ICC and the ICJ in recent weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. It's difficult to follow such moving presentations as we've already heard, and to come to the more pedestrian subject matter of law and how it applies to this most transparent genocide the people of the world has ever been exposed to. And what I would say as a prelude is that we shouldn't be depending on the actions of law to correct an evil process of this magnitude and severity. Law at its best, and that's been manifest, I think, in the workings of the International Court of Justice, within the UN system, is not self-enforcing, for one thing. It takes too long, for another thing. And it prides itself on being overly balanced in assessing competing claims of sovereign states. And what is strange, in a way, is that international law never been as visibly invoked in an international crisis during my lifetime as it has in the last few weeks in relation to Gaza. And that's partly an expression of outrage and frustration with the behavior of states, the behavior of the UN. It's a kind of desperate last resort to have something from the outside come and somehow end this horrendous display of genocidal violence. And at the same time, it gives to civil society throughout the world a legitimation for the protests, for the boycotts, divestment, demands, sanctions. It has, even though it doesn't have the capability in a situation of this sort to really change the behavior of defiant geopolitical actors, it does have the capacity to legitimize the opposition and the militancy of people around the world. It functioned this way in relation to the much lesser harms being done to the African people in South Africa during the apartheid days. It has a relevance, it's supposed to have a relevance to the behavior of states, but what its real relevance to is to the behavior of people, because it grounds a moral outrage in something that seems objective and meaningful for the peoples of the world. And I want to say just one more thing, which is that the most I wouldn't say the most shocking, but the outside of Gaza, the most reprehensible behavior is the complicity of the liberal democracies of the West. Even though I've been a lifelong critic of U.S. foreign policy, I never thought it would sink as low as this, to pretend that this genocide that all of us see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears is somehow a justifiable act of defense. And to say that students who react as the government should react are violating the rights, are engaged in hate speech, is to behave in a scandalous manner with respect to not only morality, but to law of a fundamental sort that had been supposedly the guide to liberal values. And liberal values never lived up to their promise, but this is such an exposure, maybe, as Susan has said, to the world that we've allowed to happen, which is the world comfortable for billionaires, but not most of the people. Maybe that is part of the cost imposed on citizens for the complacency of allowing this kind of political dynamic to get this far. But it is the criminality of this complicity. And everyone knows that if the U.S. had even 50% embodied the values it claims to value, Israel could not continue with this genocidal onslaught. And so we should focus not only on Gaza and on what Israel has done, but the great failure of the liberal democracies of the global West. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard. You managed to put so much into quite a short thing, and I think that the focus on the words complicity and complacency and the moral outrage that the youth and many governments in the global south are expressing, so far without having the force to bring about the change that is going to happen. Thank you so much for that. Chandra, would you like to take up from Richard there?
Yes.
And from our earlier speakers?
Yeah. Thank you, Victoria. Peace be upon you, especially all my friends who are here, and to others who may be watching this particular discussion, this conversation. I would like to begin by expressing my support for all that has been said. Susan's presentation was moving. It resonated with me, and I'm sure with a lot of other people, because she speaks as someone who has been part of that situation, of that tragedy, and who is able to reflect on what has happened through the great gift that she has as a writer and as a thinker. And Swee Chai, Dr. Swee Chai, again, like Susan, someone who's been there in the actual struggle, who transformed herself after seeing what had happened in Shabra Shatila in Lebanon. And as a result of that, she has committed herself totally to the Palestinian cause. A clarion call to us to continue with this struggle, to continue with this noble struggle to bring about change in Palestine and through Palestine, the rest of the world. We're all part of Gaza. We're all Gazans. We're all Palestinians at this particular point in time. And Richard, I think, echoed the sentiments that many of us have expressed at other places. And Richard, as always, did in his own very articulate manner, in an analytical manner, and has shown us our frustrations, what our frustrations are with the law and with existing global institutions. And that would be the starting point of my very brief presentation on the global south, which is what Victoria had asked me to do. I think this is the frustration of the vast majority of people in the world, that you have millions and millions of people protesting, expressing their utter disgust at what has been happening. And yet, the slaughter continues. The devastation continues. No one is able to stop this. And the state, and it's not just the state system, it's a state supported by the people. The overwhelming majority of people in that particular state is real. They tell the world that they don't care. They'll continue to do what they are doing. It is this arrogance which I'm sure some of you are aware of this. It's an arrogance which is mentioned in the Quran in relation to what Israelis, what a segment of the Jewish population has done. But bear this in mind that it is not a condemnation of the Jewish people. And I repeat this very often when I talk to fellow Muslims and to others who are part of this struggle, the global south. It is not a condemnation of the Jews as such. Because if you look at all the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran, they're all Jews. And Islam recognizes that. This is Islam's tradition. Every one of those prophets is precious to Muslims. It is a condemnation of a particular form of behavior. It's a condemnation of arrogance. It's a condemnation of haughtiness. It's a condemnation of an insolent attitude, manifested not just by some of the Jews that are mentioned in the Quran, but also other people. This is also mentioned in the Quran, the sort of attitude which is utterly disgusting, it's revolting. And this is what we are seeing. And we must stand up against attitudes of this sort. Arrogance, insolence, this notion that one can dominate other people, one can control other people, that a certain group of people, individuals, doesn't matter who they are the only ones who count, that they are different from others, they're superior to others. What applies to other people don't apply to them. This notion that they are at the center of the universe. And this is what we have witnessed. And I think if you talk to people in the global south, and the few people that I've talked to and people that I've been in touch with over the last 7 months, this is what they keep telling me about what is happening. How can a people act in this way? How can they be so insensitive to human suffering? How can they perpetuate this sort of suffering? And especially highlighted, by the massacre of children, that 15,000 children may have been killed. And again, friends, if you look at what Israel, its security forces, and others who are part of this massacre, who contributed to this massacre, the settlers in the West Bank, what they have done. It is something which should not shock us, because it has happened before, even in recent years. 2014, if you look at what happened in Gaza, a huge number of children were killed. Almost 1/3 of those who were killed were children. So this is a pattern. The massacre of children is part of the attempt to accomplish the primary goal of Israel as a state and the Israeli people as represented at this point in time, which is basically exterminating the Palestinians, wiping them out from the face of the earth. This is the goal. And I think it is sad that so many of our friends in the West have been so slow to realize this. This has been one of my great disappointments, that this has been the goal right from the beginning, right from 1948. How else do you explain the 750,000 people who were expelled, evicted from their homes, the thousands who were killed in 48 itself, and all that has been happening since then? It's happened over and over again. This is not the first time that this is happening to Gaza. This is the 6th time. And some say that it's even more than 6 times. It includes the other occasions when Gaza has been subjected to this sort of horrendous, this type of cruel behavior. It's been going on and on. And yet you find there's been so little response to this. Even today, governments in the West, a number of them have gone along with what has been happening in Gaza. They're not taking the side of the Palestinians at all, including, apart from the United States of America. Look at Britain. Look at some of the other countries, the positions that they've taken openly. And look at their intelligentsia. the educated segment of these societies, how have they reacted? They're aware of what's happening. There's been very little response from them. We're not talking about the students. We're not talking about other segments of society. But that stratum of Western society, it has been so disgraceful. It's been such a shame. If I were part of any of these societies, I would be so ashamed of myself that I can witness this sort of tremendous cruelty, this inhumanity, this utter bestial, brutal, barbaric behavior, and still behave as if nothing has happened, and worse, support this horrendous massacre. Isn't this amazing that this can happen? And this from people who have preached to all of us in the global south about human rights all this while. And they can do this. Aren't they ashamed of themselves? Are these human beings? This is what a lot of my friends ask, friends, and I want to share this with you. The ultimate question they ask is this: are these human beings? How can they do things like this? How can they accept these things? Worse still, how can they condone what has been happening? So this is the challenge that confronts us. What sort of global system do we have? What sort of international institutions do we have? What sort of international law do we have that allows all these things to happen? This is why when I saw what was happening in the first few weeks of this terrible tragedy, and then I read a couple of articles by people who are also linked to us, people like Chris Hedges, when he asked for forgiveness from the children of the war for what had happened, and the children of Gaza and Palestine in particular. He asked for forgiveness. I felt the same way, that we have children, we have grandchildren, that we could have allowed this to happen. How can we ever live with our conscience after what has happened? I know that Gaza is not the only tragedy of this sort. It's not the only genocide in history. We know that the nation that supports Israel was also born out of Holocaust. It wiped out the indigenous people to a great extent. It wiped out the African population to a great extent and enslaved them. This is the record of the United States of America. We know that. We know this record of many other countries who are very much part of this, who have been very enthusiastic in their support of Israel, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Look at their backgrounds. These are all countries where we have had this phenomenon of settler colonies, wiping out indigenous people, taking over these countries without a sense of shame. This is the reality. And how is it that those of us who studied international relations and political science, we were never really exposed to this? This is the truth. I was one of those students who studied these things at a university in the global south, which was modeled on the British pattern, Singapore. That's where I studied. And I was not told any of these things. I was told very good lecturers, teachers in international relations, but there's not a word about this terrible injustice. And yet I would argue that this is the most dominant feature of global politics and of international relations. Hegemony, dominance, the enslavement, the marginalization of people, and the hypocrisy that goes along with this. This is what we should be told. This is what we should convey to our young people. So when I began teaching in my own country, Malaysia, I made it a point to emphasize this in my lectures, much to the dislike of some of my colleagues many of them were Malaysians. They could not accept this. This was something totally unusual for them. because this is the way we have been brainwashed. For generations, this is what has happened to us. And this is the reason why, in reference to what Dr. Swee Chai had talked about and what Susan had talked about, this is why I think there's been so little reaction from so many countries in the world, apart from those who are right there in the forefront, who have been active, who have been campaigning. But look at the rest of society. Why is it? Even in the global south, where, you know, the vast majority of countries in the global south, they recognize Palestine. Just yesterday, I looked at a map of all those countries in the world that have recognized Palestine. It's overwhelming. And you can see the contrast so clearly. Nearly all the countries that have recognized Palestine are from the global south, Latin America, Africa, Asia. And then you have, of course, the Western countries. Most of them haven't recognized Palestine. But even in these societies, shouldn't we ask ourselves this question? Why is it that at the level of people, there's so little reaction to what is happening? There isn't much reaction. Some demonstrations here and there, but given the magnitude of what's happening, the enormity of our tragedy, what confronts us, we would have expected much more. But we don't see this. We don't see it in Pakistan. We don't see it in Iran. We don't see it in Egypt. We don't see it anywhere. Why? Partly because I think of the power of Israeli propaganda. It is really very, very powerful. Now I'm beginning to see its impact, where a lot of people, especially at that level of society, have chosen to be silent. They may not be happy, but they will not speak up. In my own country, and being very honest, Malaysia is one of the countries that is very strong in its opposition to Israel and what has been happening in Gaza. And yet you will find that amongst the intelligentsia, it's lukewarm. The response is lukewarm. And I agree with what Swee Chai had said. If you look at Singapore, even the government has changed a bit because of the people, I suppose, to some extent. The fact that they forced the Israeli embassy to take down that obnoxious announcement that they had carried on their website. They were able to do that, which was quite a good thing, because if you look at the past, they have been very, very friendly with the Israeli government. There are little changes here and there of that sort, but as far as people are concerned, measured against the magnitude of what has been happening, I think the response has been disappointing. Much more can be done, and we're not doing it. We're allowing, and I want to conclude on this note, we're allowing a people, an entire people, the Palestinian people, with such a rich history. We're allowing a people to be wiped out, and we just witnesses to this. Of course, we are angry. Of course, we make speeches and write articles and network and try to mobilize. But what we're doing is so little compared to the magnitude of the tragedy that confronts us. How can we allow this to happen? This is why I hope that somehow what has happened, even though it isn't what we would like to see, that this can be sustained into the future. And I'm very, very doubtful. I'm very, very doubtful. Having been part of social movements of this sort for a very long while, I know that it may not be possible to sustain this. The protests, the anger, expressed here and there, I do not know whether we'd be able to sustain this into the future. But this is very important. Let us think about this. Let's talk about this. Let's see what we can do in this very difficult situation to sustain what has been started by a lot of people. If we can keep it going, then perhaps there is some hope for the future. But even if we cannot sustain it, many of us will continue to speak, continue to write, and continue to express our sadness and our anger at what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chandra. There are several questions which relate very much to what you've specifically talked about. And after Joe has just responded to you, I'm going to take some of those questions. So please, Joe, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. We are, of course, as all the previous speakers so eloquently have said, we are at a critical moment in human history. And there are, I think, two ways of looking at this. The first and the most emotionally difficult for anyone with any sense of humanity to look at is, of course, the catastrophe that's continuing to unfold. And regrettably, much as a number of governments, some international institutions, including legal ones, and civil society are saying and doing, it's not stopping the mayhem, the destruction, the evil that is gradually taking place, or not so gradually, in Gaza. But I do think there's another which ought to be borne in mind. And that is that those who are at the heart of unleashing this mindless, barbaric assault are themselves in great difficulty. And I think this is what is beginning to emerge in the discourse and the discussion amongst intellectuals, academic circles, amongst students, but way beyond. It's early stages, but I think it's a very important insight. I mean, let's face it, Israel is now at an impasse. What do we see? We see a sharply polarized society, a divided government, and one of them, possibly the most unpopular prime minister since the creation of the State of Israel, whose political survival rests on satisfying the demands of a motley group of extremist, uneducated parties and leaders, and seemingly very little by way of a clear plan as to when exactly the fighting will end, what would follow. I think it can be said without contradiction, I think, that international sympathy and support for the State of Israel is now at its lowest ebb since 1948. In other words, what I'm trying to depict is that Israel now finds itself in a mess, the State of Israel. And I'm not sure that it will be able to extricate itself from this mess in the foreseeable future. And therefore, I think we need to keep that in mind when we are trying to establish, if you like, the balance of forces. They may be able to unleash violence, physical violence, on an incredible scale. But whether they're able to impose their will is now in doubt, as it has never been before. And for the United States, its chief backer, and as Richard was saying, we have to turn our minds to those who are accomplices. And the United States is the arch accomplice. Well, it's not an accomplice, it's a prime mover. What do we see in terms of its real position as opposed to what's seen by the naked eye? If you apply a little bit of X-ray vision, you see the United States saddled with an ally of dubious value in the longer run. It is saddled with an excruciating dilemma, which now looks beyond its capacity to resolve. It can continue to serve as Israel's principal backer, bear the rising costs of economic and military aid, and it has to do that in Ukraine and several other places as well, remember, suffer the diplomatic damage associated with shielding Israeli leaders from the inevitable legal and political fallout. Or it could demand that Israel end its military and accommodate the Palestinian demand for self-determination. Now, this second option is no doubt beyond the grasp of America's political and military establishment, as things stand today. And on the international front, the United States has to contend not just with Gaza and Ukraine, but with a third flashpoint over China-Taiwan relations. And even allies in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere are less and less inclined to rely upon, are less and less inclined to really comply with US directives and priorities. We need only remember the very strong speech that the Spanish Prime Minister delivered in a withering attack on Israel and its Prime Minister just a few days ago, when announcing Spain's intention to recognize the state of Palestine, together with 2 other European countries. And in the case of the Global South, it seems to have a renewed sense of its capacity. It's been very long in coming, admittedly, but there is now a sense of newly found confidence just beginning to emerge. The Global South is increasingly confident that it can make certain judgments and pursue them regardless of the displeasure, Washington's displeasure. And China, Russia, and Iran are now better placed to pursue their preferred strategic options, confident in the knowledge that the United States is amply distracted by the paralysis of its political institutions and its engagements in conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, which in the longer run cannot be won, and which in the long run will deliver much pain and very little reward. And so I'm struck by one commentator's conclusion, and I quote, "The Gaza genocide is doing great damage to American standing, not just in the Arab street, but across the Western world and in the Global South and in American universities. In one sense, it could be said that Israel may prove to be the death of America. A bold prediction, perhaps, but it seems less and less implausible." Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wrap up. Joe, there are a couple of questions which I hope you won't mind. I'm going to link together and address them first of all to Susan. Ken Blackman quotes your Gaza is us by saying, "But Gaza is not yet us, and how can we make it so?" And at the same time, Nithi is asking, how can we accelerate the turning of the tide, which I think is very much the essence of a lot of all our responses to what's been said by all of you. Susan, would you like to go first, as it was your phrase that that kicked Ken off with his question?
Sure. So I think it's easy to despair, and to focus on the disappointment that we just heard from Chandra, and I admit that I too fall into that. However, there is a lot of reason for revolutionary optimism. And frankly, for me, some of that comes from Palestinian resistance, from the armed resistance wings. They are facing all the like extraordinary odds. And this is a very lightly armed guerrilla group resisting multiple nuclear powers with the most advanced weaponry, the most advanced surveillance technology, artificial intelligence, and they continue to gain on the battlefield. All of these powers combined from air, land, and sea have not been able to defeat them. And to me, that is real cause for what I just said of revolutionary optimism. And there are plenty of historic examples that I think other panelists can speak more intelligently about that point to the unsustainability of such an oppressive force in the world that is so blatantly flaunting its power, its bullying. That kind of force is just not sustainable, and history sort of promises us that. I think the things that we are doing, and frankly led by the young people in this country, of course, Palestinians in Palestine and around the world have been doing this work for decades, but speaking of the United States alone, the movement that we're seeing on campuses, on the streets, is truly cause for optimism. It's not enough, and in the larger picture, it's a small portion of American society. But I think what they are inspiring is not just about the carnage in Gaza. And this is part of the reason why I sort of brought in this context of sustained capitalist suppression and repression and oppression, and people who have experienced oppression at the hands of this sort of elite class are finding common cause in what's happening in Gaza. And the people, and those represent the majority of humanity. And so to me, that's great cause for optimism. As to what we do and how we advance it and how we sustain it, I think we already have a blueprint of things that are working. And and it's a matter of expanding this and recruiting more people into these ranks. It's something that requires sustained, unrelenting perseverance, and to really kind of let go of this idea that if we don't see change in the next week or the next month or even the next year, then our efforts are fruitless. Revolutionary change sometimes doesn't happen in our lifetimes, but the work that we do now will lay the foundations for that, just like what we're doing now is based on foundations that were laid by revolutionaries before us. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, and have a kind of resistance mentality that pervades everything that we do and all the personal choices that we make on a daily basis. And these are choices of, you know, who we speak to, what we read, what we buy, where we shop. And you know, it's and as educators, I mean, you know, what people do in universities, what they do in their jobs, what they use with their talents, what songs they write, what they popularize in media, who they follow on social media. I mean, social media is a truly powerful forum for us. And at the same time, it is a powerful repressive force, as we've seen with a lot of the censorship and the sort of manipulation to mold public discourse. But it is still something that is available to us. And we have a lot at our at our disposal. And it's a matter of, you know, they say, you know, the personal is political and the political is personal. And it is in making a daily choice to find what's working and what is and to do it, and you know, it's protests, it's you know, there's lawyers on this panel, there's you know, the courts are another forum for us, as you know, South Africa has proven. International courts and domestic courts, we have so much available to us. And so that is, you know, that is how we expand it, is just perseverance and not letting up. And I really do believe in the depths of me that Palestine will be free, from the river to the sea. And that doesn't mean the annihilation of Jews or any of the other stupid things that they claim that means, but it does mean freedom, and everything that term implies, freedom for everybody who is between the river and the sea. And it is that belief that really sustains me and guides what I do and what I write and what I say. So sorry, I rattled on a little bit. Apologies, but
no, you didn't rattle on at all. You were really inspiring, as always, Susan. And I think that the way you brought it down for a lot of people listening, to remember that this question of every personal choice you make in what you do or what you say or who you say it to makes a difference. And that is what we have to kind of keep going, in the belief that, as you said, I think we share. Most of us on this call, we share. Palestine will be free. I want to, as time is running on, and I'm afraid there are going to be some questions that we don't quite manage to get to, but I want to give this one to Richard from Virginia. She's asking about the question of the US dominance of the Security Council and the General Assembly not having any power, in the sense because the Security Council can always just cancel it, as we've seen time and time again recently. I know there's something you've written about and spoken before about, Richard, but I think it would be good just to reply to Virginia with your view on this.
Let me try. We have to keep in mind that after World War II in 1945, the victorious powers in the war against Germany and Japan wanted a UN that was geopolitically weak. It didn't want it promised lots of things in its preamble, but then in its constitutional framework, it withdrew the means to achieve them by giving the most dangerous and powerful countries the right of veto, which in effect gives them a legal foundation for pursuing their strategic interests in defiance of the Charter and of international law generally. And so I have felt for some time that the future of the UN depends on the self-empowerment of the General Assembly, that we cannot any longer accept this hegemony exercised by the Security Council over what the only real organization of governments in the world is enabled to do. And it's up to the global South to take the initiative. It did it in the 1970s with respect to economic development. Now it is challenged, I believe, to do it with respect to war prevention and to genocide prevention and to the promotion of the kinds of values that are embodied in the preamble of the UN Charter. In other words, the democratization of the UN is part of that revolutionary transformation that will make the dawn that Swee spoke of become sunlight as far as the future of the UN is concerned. It has lost legitimacy along with international law because it has done as so little given the magnitude of what Israel and its supporters are doing in defiance of international law and the UN Charter. What Chandra so movingly depicted was the disappointment that he felt, and I share the feeling, that so little has really been done at an intergovernmental level, and even civil society has seemed to awaken, to be very slow to have awakened, given the what I previously called the transparency and the real-time awareness of genocide and the complacency and complicity of the most powerful government in the world in the face of that proclaimed liberal values. So there is many reasons why the UN needs to exist in a world that is faced with a series of global challenges that can't be met by separate states, and it needs to be reinforced in ways that it can circumvent this geopolitical paralysis that has existed from the 1945 onward and was part of the architecture of the UN. It's not the UN's fault. In a certain sense, the UN is doing what it was set up to do, which is to give impunity and non-accountability to the 5 winners in World War II. And it must be challenged on that faulty foundation for world peace and justice.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think we're going to run over just a very few minutes because I want to respond to a question that we have from one of our coordinating group in SHAPE, Hans von Sponeck. He's written, "The trauma of Gaza will have a long life. to do something about what we have recognized would seem our challenge. What should this involve? I'm going to ask Hans just to respond to his own question. And for those people who don't know him, maybe some of our younger watchers will not realize that Hans von Sponeck was the most important. He was the UN coordinator of humanitarian affairs during Iraq and the sanctions against Iraq. He resigned on principle, like his predecessor, Dennis Halliday. And I think that these men have such a moral standing in the world that they are exactly the kind of people who allow us to keep our optimism. And even in everything that we're feeling about Gaza today, I would just like to hear Hans just say a few words. Sorry to bounce this on you, Hans. Are you unmuted? Oh, there you go. Yeah, you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself? Hassan Ali, can you unmute him?
Yeah, just ask him to unmute. You can click the button.
Be patient with us. He's unmuted. The floor is yours, Hans.
Well, I just wanted to say, and I hope Dr. Chai agrees with me, that trauma, the Gaza trauma, will have a long life. And the implications of that has implications for us as people who want to make a difference. And I want to try and suggest that after we, day after day, in fact, minute after minute, our knowledge about something which I, as an 85-year-old person, have never had in my life before, even though I come out of a country that was in war when I was young, we have the knowledge. Do we need more knowledge about Gaza brutality? Well, if we do, then read Susan's book. Susan's book, I don't know you, Susan, you don't know me, but your book is every day an encouragement for me to take one aspect more seriously than I had before, and that is the obligation to implement. It's no good that day after day we speak about the misery, and then we are falling short on the issue of what can we do? Now, what can we do? First of all, I would say we can learn from the young. We can learn from the students on the campuses that try, as it was said before, to do what governments should have done. They do it. We can also do it, and we must do it. So the protests can continue. But more than that, let us not be shy or believe that we make no difference. Maybe we make no difference. But writing to governments, writing to the Secretary General, writing to NGOs, writing to the World Social Forum, even the Economic Forum, to express our outrage as a group, as individuals, I think are certainly steps that we should and must take now. It's no good that we feel good that we are expressing ourselves in solidarity with the Gaza and Palestinian people and then think that's enough. It's not enough. So human rights, to me, ultimately has only a value if it can make a difference. And we can make a difference, and we should believe and not be shy that as individuals or as small groups in some small town make no difference. Every voice makes a difference. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for saying it. I think you make the most powerful ending of this very wonderful, very rich time we've spent together. And all I would add to it is that I think that our inspiration in this thing comes in this horror and the feeling of impotence. Is we can't accept the feeling of impotence. And for me, reading the poetry of Palestinian poets, such as everybody knows Rifat, and knows his poem, which starts, "If I must die, you must live to tell my story." And that's what we have to do. And I think all those poets and all those journalists who are still working, despite in Gaza, despite 147 of them having been killed, these people are my heroes, just as much as the doctors, the civil volunteers who give dignity to everybody who dies. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being with us, and thank you, conveners, for organizing it. And this is us saying goodbye.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful